Okay, well, hello. The title of my talk is The Presumptiveness of Reality. I got an email a couple of weeks ago from Bruce, who wanted to know the title of my talk. And I wrote back and I said, well, do you have any suggestions? What do you want me to talk about? He had a couple of suggestions, but one thing he asked was, have you ever read The Case of Against Reality by Donald Hoffman? And indeed I have, and here it is. And so this inspired me to give this talk. It's a very interesting book. It'll actually, I highly recommend it. It'll surprise you. It's about the nature of reality and how we misinterpret reality. As soon as people start talking about a different kind of reality or a different interpretation of reality, they immediately say, oh, how Buddhist. People do have the sense in Buddhism that we learn to experience reality differently. We have the idea of emptiness. We talk a lot about delusion. We talk about attaining knowledge and vision of things as they are, which suggests that normal people don't see things as they are. So anyway, this book is in this genre. Another good example is The Matrix, which a lot of people say is very Buddhist. Probably most of you have seen it, but it presents a reality in which virtually everybody is living in a computer simulation that they interpret as being the world out there as it really is. The world is basically not what we think. Now, the case against reality that Donald Hoffman presents is quite radical. Normally, we assume that there's an objective reality out there, a world out there that is independent of us, but we as humans are able to perceive that world out there largely the way it is. In common sense terms, we think there's no effort to perceive the world out there. It's right here. We just show up and here it is. It's all around us. We don't have to do anything special. But scientists can carry this further and see deeper into the world out there. We always assume that the world out there is greater than what we can perceive at any moment, and that's why we have certain tools that allow us to look more closely, like a magnifying glass, and we can see the objective reality. So this idea that humans can see objective reality, something beyond themselves, accurately, is a very old idea, and it gave rise to modern science. It was the basis of modern science until the 20th century, pretty much. Still is the basis of most fields of science. It's interesting, it actually came, the original argument that we could see the objective world out there accurately came from Christian theology, that God is a rational being and created the world in a rational way, and he made people rational so that they could see what he created. And kind of the proto-scientific idea was that when we look at the world in detail out there, we're looking into the mind of God. And so anyway, this gave us this idea. So Hoffman really challenges this idea. he says uh, one of the arguments for the idea in modern terms is that evolutionarily we developed to see the world accurately. Because if we can see the world accurately, we know how to act in the world. So it has a fitness potential. So it improves our survivability to see the world accurately. Donald Hoffman argues the opposite. He says that we are evolved to see the world in simplistic terms that are not at all like what the world out there looks like. And he uses the analogy very effectively of a graphical interface to a computer. You have your computer screen and you have all of these things you can click on, icons. You can click on one icon and suddenly the computer starts running your word processor or your Zoom connection. You can drop something into a basket and a folder into a basket and it does something. What you're doing provides an interface, but it's not anything like what the computer's actually doing for you. It's a simplified interface because understanding what the computer is actually doing is too complicated. So Donald Hoffman argues that the world out there is too complicated for us to see accurately. We have an interface that is purposely hides what's really going on out there so that we can deal with things cognitively in an efficient way. Anyway, it's fascinating reading. So what I want to do is, what did the Buddha teach? So some people look at, Hoffman, or they look at quantum physics, which has some unusual, kind of radical things to say about the world out there. Quantum physics is kind of on the forefront of probing into what the world objective reality must be like. And it's getting to the point where they say, objective reality, a lot of scientists will now say this, objective reality does not have time and it doesn't have space. Time and space are part of our interface that our mind creates for us, would be what Donald Hoffman would derive from that. Quite radical. So people often say, well, the Buddha, he said we don't see reality accurately. And so people go on to attribute, they say, well, he was kind of a precursor of quantum physics, or even that he knew quantum physics 2,500 years ago. So I want to talk about what did the Buddha teach in this regard. First of all, we normally think that we interpret the world correctly, but we do realize that we don't always. We do have things like mirages and optical illusions, or sometimes if we're inebriated, we don't quite see things clearly, or if you're not wearing your glasses. And so we can talk about the objective world on the one hand, and talk about the world of experience, how we experience the world, how the world appears in our experience as two different things. Well, interestingly, the Buddha had no interest in the world of reality or objective reality. For him, the world is totally subjective. It is the world of experience. And so there's a couple of quotes on this. He says, in this fathom-long living body, along with its perceptions and thoughts, lies the world, the arising of the world, and the cessation of the world. So this gives a sense of subjectivity. It is our world of experience that he's talking about. Also, for those that have read the Dhammapada, the very first sentence of the Dhammapada is all phenomena are preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. So everything has to go through the mind. So for the Buddha, this is our reality. He is rarely refers to any kind of objective reality beyond the way we experience reality. And it's easy to see why. Because our suffering is in our experienced reality. It's not an objective reality. Our practice is in experienced reality, the way we experience the world. And our awakening is in our experienced reality. It's independent of objective reality. Now, the Buddha, which is quite typical of him, he basically did not approach any of the philosophical questions that arise around this, such as we have our world of experience, but is there an objective reality at all? For all we know, we might be living in a computer simulation, and there's no objective reality that corresponds to what we experience. Or maybe we're caught in a dream. We're just dreaming everything. How would we know? But then there may be an objective reality, and it might look a lot like my world of experience, or it might not, or it might be some kind of mixture of a objective reality and my experience of that reality. It could be any of those things. So the Buddha basically avoids the question altogether. Okay, so somebody gave a little, Albert Einstein said, and this is the chat, reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. There you go. So for the Buddha, we have our subjective world, the side of the practice, the world as we experience. But one of the things that we do in our world of experience is we presume. We presume a lot. We presume a world out there. We presume an objective world. We presume a self. We presume all kinds of things that exist out there in the objective world. And we act on the basis of our presumptions. I use the word presumption to translate a Pali word. And as far as I know, I'm the only one that translates it this way. It's usually the Pali word is manita. But most people translate it as imagination, something that we imagine. But I notice every time it's used, it comes also, it's not just conceptualizing or imagining something, but it always comes with a conviction that this is real. So we create reality out of our presumptions. Now, where do our presumptions come from? Well, the Buddha says that we know that they're presumptions because we can watch our mind creating them. When we look very, very close at the mind's just fabricating away. It's creating these things, and what we presume, the main things we presume, are not really justified. We can see that we create these presumptions on very limited evidence. But we can also see that if we assume that these things are true of the world out there, we see that there are a lot of contradictions in the world out there, the way we've presumed it. So we can look at the mind. We know we see a world, a rich world. Each one of us, we see a different world around us, different people inhabiting that world, different objects in the room in which you're sitting, but all of the information that is actually entering the mind comes through the senses. The brain itself, which we presume is the site of our cognition, our information processing, sits in darkness and in silence inside our skulls. But it has neurons that go out to the senses, and what it receives from the senses are just sense impressions. Basically, from the eyes, it receives pixels, an array of pixels. From the ears, it receives sound waves. And then there's a lot of interpretation that goes on. And some of this interpretation is highly presumptive. So we have to presume in order to make much sense of the world. But our presumptions get us in trouble. So the number one presumption that we make, of course, is the self. When we presume the self, we think of the self as a substantial object. The self is relatively permanent. Some of us assume that the self is eternal. Some of us assume that the self is there in a rather as a rather permanent essence until we die, in which case it disappears. Those of us who think that way are annihilationists. But we also presume a lot of other things about the self that get us in a lot of trouble. We also presume that objects around us exist with the same permanence and substantiality. So the Buddha warns us about presumption. He says, presumption is a disease. Presumption is a tumor. Presumption is a dart. By overcoming all presumptions, Bhikkhu, one is called a sage at peace. And the sage at peace is not born, does not age, does not die. He is not shaken and does not yearn. For there is nothing present in him by which he might be born. So even birth and death are presumptions that we make. Once we have a self, or any other thing, we have birth and death of that self or of that thing. So how do we recognize presumptions, and what do we do to eliminate them? Now, it's a tall order to remove all presumptions. But remember, presumptions are imagination plus the conviction that this is really true. Our imagination can be very useful for us. So sometimes it's useful to imagine that I am a self. If we want to walk across the street without getting run over by a car, it's a very useful a useful thing to imagine, but we don't have to actually presume it. We don't have to think it's really, really true. We can say, well, it's conventionally true. Okay, so we practice to undermine our perceptions, our presumptions. This is the most of what we do in wisdom practice. Okay, the Buddha gives us a very good analogy that our presumptions are like a magic show. In fact, consciousness is like a magic show because consciousness is what gives us these presumptions and then convinces us that these things are true. So the Buddha says, now suppose that a magician or a magician's apprentice were to display a magic trick at a major intersection, and a man with good eyesight were to see it, observe it, and appropriately examine it. To him, seeing it, observing it, and appropriately examining it, it would appear empty, void, without substance. For what substance could there be in a magic trick? So the idea is if we're sitting in the audience, we're convinced it's true. Somehow or other, it defies all logic, but seeing is believing. And, the magician really did saw a woman in half, but she's fine. Or made rabbits and birds appear, all of these things that magicians do. We're convinced that they're real, and yet they defy our sense of reality. So magicians trick us. So what the Buddha is suggesting is that we be a good man with good eyesight and appropriately examine this. Maybe we can sneak behind stage and watch the magician. And then we see all of the props, the mirrors and the black boxes and the curtains and things that the people in the audience do not see. And then we see there's no basis to the trick, that it's empty, void, without substance. So we avoid being convinced. So the Buddha continues, in the same way, a monk sees, observes, and appropriately examines any consciousness that is past, future, or present, inner or outer, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near. To him, seeing it, observing it, and appropriately examining it, it would appear empty, void, without substance. For what substance could there be in consciousness? So consciousness is like a magic show. It's tricking us all of the time. So why do we want to see our presumptions? Because on the basis of what we presume, we crave, we attach to things, we develop our sense of self that causes us so much suffering, our sense of personal identity that causes us so much suffering. And we can avoid that if we can see inside of presumptions. So notice the approach is to get behind the stage to see what the basis of the magic tricks are, or to see what the basis of our consciousness is. And we can do that in our contemplative practice. We look at the process by which we develop our apprehension of the world through our feelings, defining certain things as mattering to us or as important, or highlighting certain things. And then our perceptions, things that we can recognize out of familiarity. And then our fabrications, the things that we derive through reasoning or just invent, which is what presumptions are. And finally, this very rich sense that we are in the midst of a world out there that we take very seriously. What we always see over and over again is the Buddha is the ultimate skeptic. He just doesn't accept anything. And when he talks about knowledge and vision of things as they are, it's very common to interpret that as being able to see the world out there with new eyes and being able to penetrate what's going on out there. This is why people attribute to the Buddha the ability to see quantum physics and things like that. But when we see that his mission really is to undermine the presumptions that we have about reality, the fabrications that we create quite readily and then believe, we see that the basis of knowledge and vision of things as they are is not insight into the world out there, but insight into the constructedness of that world, of the world as we experience it. Okay. Any questions?
I'd like to thank Bhante for the talk. Excellent material, much food for thought. Thank you.
You're very welcome. One thing you look at when you look at the Buddha, and he just shines through so clearly if you read the early texts. His thinking is so sophisticated. He thinks about things quite differently than anybody else at his time, and yet a lot of his ideas are based in his culture. But he's very psychological, and his teachings really go into the mind. This is largely what he discovers in dependent co-arising, and conditionality is looking at these factors, not in the world out there, but how the mind, how these things arise in the mind. Even for modern cognitive scientists, he's quite impressive in his understanding.
Thank you so much, Bhante, for the talk. It's very deep and very thought-provoking, but it's also very truth. So can Bhante shed a little light about Buddhism and quantum physics, between the Buddha's teaching and quantum physics?
So what's the difference, or?
What's the relationship?
Oh, okay. So both of them. So the Buddha is not interested in explaining the world as the objective world. He's not a scientist. He's not, at least not a scientist of the physical world. He's not probing into the nature of objective reality. Rather, he's looking at the mind and how the mind works, and he sees how almost anything you find that you think is part of objective reality, it's solid, it's right there, is fabricated. So he goes very deep in that direction. Quantum physicists started looking in the opposite direction, rather than looking inward at the mind. They're looking at physical reality. But what they discover there is, where the Buddha discovers that the mind is making up what we think is reality out there. Quantum physicists are discovering that what reality out there is impossible to describe without the mind. So this is quite amazing, and we've known about this for almost 100 years. The quantum physicists were just amazed. You have the split beam experiment that demonstrated that what plays out in reality is not predetermined, but the fact that you're observing it will make a difference in how reality plays out. Reality, as soon as it comes in contact with consciousness, becomes a different reality. It collapses from an indeterminate state into a determinate state, as if it wants to present itself to us that way. It's quite amazing. There's another book for people that want to look at this aspect of quantum physics called The Quantum Enigma. It has two authors. The first one is Rosenblum, I think, with Blum. And if you get a hold of that, it's very, very clear. So Quantum Enigma, he's explaining the enigma of quantum physics. They cannot get rid of the mind as a variable or consciousness as a variable in their theories, which means Albert Einstein, he had this insight: reality is merely an illusion. However, in his life, he was totally against quantum physics. He just thought it was absurd because of the conclusions that they were coming to. So it was kind of a parallel track with Einstein, developing about the same time, and not long after the early Einstein. So this is very worth looking at from a Buddhist perspective. You don't have to know quantum physics, but it reaffirms what the Buddha said about the fabricated nature of reality. But the Buddha didn't really step out there. So he doesn't have a word for the objective reality. The word loka, world, is reserved for subjective reality, or the world as we experience it.
Thank you so much, Bhante. I think there's a note in the chat.
Yeah. Should we be skeptical of all we observe? The Buddha would say yes. The thing is, the Buddha, our conceptions and our interpretations of things are important for practical reasons. We have to deal with the world. We're evolved to live in the world, to eat and mate and stay warm and take care of ourselves. So we have to deal with the world that we're evolved to live in. But we should be very careful with our presumptions, because so many of them cause suffering. We are not evolved to be happy. We are evolved to suffer. Our suffering is part of our evolutionary history. And we can deal with our own angst and our own human condition, our own unethical behavior and things, if we learn to experience the world differently. So one way we can think of is not to get rid of all presumptions or conceptualizations to the extent that we can do nothing more than sit there and drool, but rather we can be engaged in the world, but we should be able to experience the world differently than we do, because how we are evolved is to experience the world in a very spiritually unhealthy way. And so the idea is really to break up our evolved and culturally determined and personally determined calcified ways of thinking about the world and interpreting the world and presuming the world in order that we can experience the world differently. If we can experience the world differently, we can experience in a healthier way. But it's surprising how skeptical the Buddha is. He says, you know, if you have any viewpoint about anything, you're probably wrong. He says, you know, let go of all viewpoints. Even the Dhamma is a viewpoint. Skepticism goes a long way. On the other hand, we do have to deal with the world, and we have to make commitments in the world. We have to do a lot of things just out of faith. Our Buddhist practice is based on faith. Almost everything we do, going to the dentist is based on faith that the dentist knows what he's doing. So be skeptical a lot would be the Buddhist advice.